Philippians chapter 2. Philippians chapter 2, we're down at verse 27. Just real quick, what's going on in this particular passage, what we've been dealing with, is that Paul is writing to the church of Philippi. Just as a reminder to those that maybe don't know, he's writing from prison in Rome. And so in writing this letter, he's sending it back with Epaphroditus. Epaphroditus is there with him, helping to tend to his needs and helping to care for him. He was actually sent from the church of Philippi. The church of Philippi, knowing that Paul is in jail there in Rome, sends Epaphroditus with a lot of needs, whether it be money, goods, I have no idea, but he sent him with a lot of stuff that Paul could use. And with the understanding that he was to stay there with Paul during that time and help him and care for his needs and just kind of, be that guy. And so when Epaphroditus gets there, either en route there or while he's there, he gets deathly ill. And so, for some length of time, he is so ill, everybody thinks he's going to die. Word had gotten back to the church of Philippi that Epaphroditus had become very ill, and so obviously they were concerned about it. And Epaphroditus is concerned for them because he doesn't want them to be troubled and worried since he has now recovered from the illness, but they don't know if he's dead or alive. They really don't even know. And so this letter, obviously Epaphroditus is delivering it. They're going to see him and he'll greet them. But Paul also mentions in the letter that Epaphroditus has done everything basically to help him like they had instructed him to do, and that he was a good representative. He continues with that thought in verse 27. So let's go ahead and pick up in verse 27 so you kind of get a picture of what he's dealing with here. It's interesting because keep in mind, every time you see these letters that Paul writes, he most always follows a similar pattern. He will about always write, in his greeting, something about, greeting them, letting them know he missed them and concerns that he has for them and that kind of thing. And you'll almost always see that. And then the second thing that you see is he begins to deal with issues that trouble him. Maybe it's doctrinal issues, maybe it's things they're having to deal with. But always, somewhere in that letter, he will always, in addition to that, add personal thoughts or personal things between the two of them to let them know that, listen, we have this kind of camaraderie, or we have this kind of closeness. He might include his testimony, or he might include just events that have taken place between them, or in this case, Philippians, he does a lot of that in a lot of different areas. But in this particular case, he includes the fact that they cared for him enough to send Epaphroditus there to help him. And so, with Epaphroditus there, he wants to make sure that they understand and they know that he and Epaphroditus, if I say that enough times, it doesn't even sound like a word anymore. But he and Epaphroditus have become good friends, and he has a lot of confidence in Epaphroditus and realizes that, you couldn't have sent a better guy to help me. He has done his job. Even in spite of the fact that he got ill, was about to die, he still has done all the things that you sent him to do. He's been a good helpmate. All right? And so that's the picture. Verse 27, for indeed he was sick, nigh unto death, but God had mercy on him, and not on him only, but on me also, lest I should have sorrow upon sorrow. So apparently his sickness was something that very well could have resulted in death, and perhaps they even expected it to end in death. And yet Paul says, listen, but God was gracious and spared his life. That's basically what he's saying. And this was a relief for Paul, because the death of Epaphroditus would have simply multiplied all the sorrows that Paul was already encountering. Keep in mind, he's in prison. And he had some who had been with him that had already returned to the things of the world and were not there with him anymore, not working with him anymore. At times, I'm sure he felt pretty lonely. Times there was not someone there to meet all of his needs. And not only that, but while he's in prison, he gets all this word from the different churches, whether it be Galatia or Ephesians or, wherever it might be, Ephesus, wherever it might be, he's getting this word that, listen, false doctrines are creeping in, things are happening, churches, some of these churches you've established went strong and going mighty, but then some things are coming in that just might crush them. I think that, they might fall by the wayside, so he's obviously concerned about that. And he's in jail, so he can't really just make a trip there to help fix it. And so these are all concerns. And not only that, but even with Philippi, knowing that they're concerned regarding Epaphroditus, they don't know if he's dead or alive. We talked about this last week. It's not like you can just send him an email, or shoot him a text. It's not like you can do that. Sometimes it was it was always at least weeks, but sometimes months before you could even get word to somebody, because we're talking about, the kind of distance. It'd be like me trying to get word from somebody over in California. And the only way I get that is for them to travel back here. And by the way, they don't have a fast vehicle. They're traveling either on foot or by an animal. It's not like they can jump in the car and drive even. And so it's not like the word gets out real quick. And so he knows that they're concerned, and that's bothering, that's weighing on him. So to compound that with his death while tending to Paul's needs, the possibility of his death while tending to Paul's needs, Paul would have clearly been consumed with a great deal of sorrow. And the last thing I need is for them to send Epaphroditus over here to die, and die because he came here. It seems apparent that whatever it is that he was sick with was sick as a result of having come over there and having come to help him. So he was fine, he was healthy at home, and he sends him out to help Paul, and as far as they know, he died. And Paul's saying that would just compound my sorrow. Now, I want you to get a picture of this, because Paul's not trying to make it all about him. What he's doing is he's simply saying, listen, but God was merciful and spared all of us. He spared me from having to deal with that. He spared Epaphroditus so that he might continue to do the work that he needs to do. He spared the church of Philippi because their good friend that they've sent over here to do this, someone they trusted in the Lord, is going to return to them. And his whole point is not just to make it about him. He's just simply saying, listen, we are all the better off for this because God was merciful and God spared him. And so he thought it would be better not to keep him here any longer, but to send him back to you because of the word that you've gotten. I think you really need him to be there with you. I don't know if you guys have ever heard this story. Bill Davenport, his dad, it was kind of funny. His dad joined our church. They were pretty old at the time. And when they came, I got this whole story about his life. And he had been in the war, all right? His dad was in the war, and he was taken prisoner. And word came back to his parents, his mom and dad, that he had died in the war. They had funeral. They did the whole 9 yards. He was dead. As far as they were concerned, he was dead. And so, they're just at home, and he comes rolling up. He gets out. Apparently, they made a deal, and he got out of the prison camps and all that, and he came back home, and they didn't expect him, didn't know he was coming, and he just rolled up at the house, and they're like, you're supposed to be dead, They thought he was dead for I don't know how long. If I'm not mistaken, I believe Bill said it was like a few years. And Bill said that his dad literally came out through the what do you call screen door? Came through the screen door. He didn't open it, just came through the screen door. His mom, who was out hanging out laundry and passed out. And what Paul is saying is, listen, it's best for you to go home. I don't want them to just get word that everything's okay. I don't want to just send word back that, listen, you're doing fine. I want them to see you. I want them to hug you. I want you guys to have the kind of fellowship and kind of relationship you need to have. I want you to rebuild that bond. They need to see you alive. And so that's why he sent him back. And he thought this would be the very best scenario. And so rather than keep him any longer, which Paul would have been content to do otherwise, he sends him back, and he sends him back with his letter. Verse 28 says, I sent him therefore the more carefully, that when you see him again, you may rejoice, and that I may be the less sorrowful. He's saying, listen, I don't want your sorrow to be on my account. It makes me sorrowful knowing that, that you're sorrowful for trying to help me out. And so he says, this is why I've sent him back. I thought it'd be best, as we just mentioned, I thought it'd be best to send him back so that you could see him face to face. I didn't want to just send word. I wanted to send him. And so he said, in doing so, actually makes me feel better. It's good for me. I think the reason he said that, again, it's not a selfish thing. He did that to say, listen, I don't want this to be about me. All right? I feel better sending him back. I don't want you to feel like, well, we should have kept him there. No, it does me better to send him back, not because he's not done his job, but because I know that you need to see him and he needs to see you. And so it makes me less sorrowful knowing that you guys are back with one another. And that's actually better for me than him being here and tending to my needs. Verse 29, receive him therefore in the Lord with all gladness, and hold such in reputation. I like this picture because what he's saying is, listen, don't just welcome him back. Don't just say, hey, good to see you. Do something special. Recognize him. Let him know. Listen, set him up. He has done you a fantastic job. Honor him. Show the respect. Let people know that, hey, listen, here is someone that has done something incredible from the church. Let's lift him up. Let's say, hey, listen, here's someone that has done good. He says, hold such in reputation. Let him be an example of what others need to do. And let him be an example of what others need to follow. I'm one of those guys. I don't have any problem letting our kids and such know. I do this with our grandchildren. As a matter of fact, I did this just recently. Yesterday, as a matter of fact, my grandkids were, Mallory and Cody had went out, and the grandkids stayed with Debbie and I, and so the girls were sitting with me. And we were just talking about stuff, and I said, we was talking about my office, and I said, man, I love my floor. It is so cool. It makes the office look so nice. And Penny said, yeah, I saw the paint. The paint was good, too. I said, yeah, it was really nice. And I said, who did these things? And I made sure that I told her who took part in all of that. And I said, this is the kind of things we do for one another. This is what people do. So what I was doing was exactly this. I wanted her to hear that, listen, there's a lot of ministry. There's a lot of work that can be done in the church. She needs to know that from a very early age. And it's good to hold people up in that kind of reputation, to say, hey, listen, these are people in our church that are doing good things. And then she started rattling off teachers' names and stuff that she knows. And she's going, like the way Miss Scarlett teaches me? I said, yes, exactly. And, so, it was that kind of a thing. And I thought, that's so good. We ought to hold each other up in that respect. God knows we spend too much time probably beating each other up. Let's praise one another occasionally, And so verse 30 then, he says, because for the work of Christ, he was nigh unto death, not regarding his life to supply your lack of service toward me. He's saying, listen, he was sick for the work of Christ. He was doing what God called him to do, and in doing what he was to do, the church sent him out. He was obedient to do that. He represents you, and in so doing, he has suffered this sickness. All right, so this was all as a result of doing what God called him to do. I can't tell you the number of times missionaries get out on the mission field to do a work, and something happens to them. My son-in-law went to Africa to do some work and got malaria. And he was sick for a long time. I've seen others that kind of that very same kind of thing can happen to. And so what happens is we see that in the case of Epaphroditus, he got out on the mission field, let's call it, to help Paul, and got very ill. Now, we don't know what he was sick from. I have no idea. I don't know if maybe he got pneumonia or hypothermia because of weather conditions. I don't know. Maybe he picked up some type of a bacteria from food or water. Maybe he come across somebody with some contagious disease and got it. I really don't know. All we know is in the work for Christ, he became deathly ill, and God miraculously saved him by God's mercy. So we're told that he had something that he had encountered because of the work for Christ. And but what we also see, he says, because the work for Christ was nigh unto death, not regarding his life to supply your lack of service toward me. So he goes on to say, but, man, he didn't let up. He didn't let up. He didn't regard his life. That was basically saying, listen, he knew he had a mission, he knew he had a job, and he didn't let the fact that he could lose his life doing it get in the way. He still did what God had called him to do and what the church had asked him to do. That last little phrase is an interesting phrase to me. He says, to supply your lack of service toward me. That's kind of terminology that we would use, and it would be kind of snarky. You know what I'm saying? I mean, a bit of sarcasm in that if it were you or I. But that's not true in what he is saying. What he is basically saying is, listen, you had sent him to do what you couldn't do. You couldn't be here to be with me. You couldn't be here when you wanted to be and to care for me and to meet my needs. I know you wanted to, but you couldn't be. And he's here because of your passion for me and because of your love and care for me, your compassion for me, and because your love and care for me. And so he said, he did exactly what you wanted him to do. He was your representative, and your lack of being able to do that, don't fret over that, because he did the job. Don't get the idea that he got sick and was sick the whole time, and so what you had hoped to accomplish didn't get accomplished. He said, oh, no. It was accomplished. This guy did what he was supposed to do. And so don't fret over that. So he more than did what you couldn't do because you're all the way back there in Philippi. And for the lack of what you were able to do yourself, you made sure you sent somebody to do it. And let me tell you, he did it. All right? And so that's the picture. And so in all of this concept of sending Epaphroditus, he's saying, you guys did good in sending Epaphroditus. He did a good job. I'm sending him back to you because you guys need to fellowship together. He needs to come back, see family, see church friends, and you guys need to be able to see him face to face. And so I'm sending him back. And I want you to know, this guy deserves the honor that you give him. He really does. He did a good job. All right? So that's the picture. You got any questions about any of that before I move into chapter 3? All right? Okay, good. It's either because you're not listening or I covered it well. I'm going to hope it's because I covered it well. All right? I'm going with that. All right? Chapter 3, verse 1. We're going to change everything up. We're done talking about Epaphroditus. He's got the personal stuff out of the way. He wanted to make sure he talked about that, wanted to make sure he mentioned that. But here is a real crux behind why he wrote this letter. I find this interesting. We're already into chapter 3. Now, you guys understand, when I say we're already into chapter 3, when he wrote this letter, he didn't write it like chapter 1, verse 1. He didn't do that. All right? He just wrote the letter. It was divided up into chapters and verses somewhere in the course of time to make it easy for us so that we could go back and find those passages of Scripture so that we could memorize portions of it. But when they wrote these letters, he just wrote a letter. So it wasn't written chapter and verse. But we are, nonetheless, about halfway through the book, all right, through the letter. And so what happens here is he's about halfway through the letter. He started out rejoicing over their friendship, their fellowship together, and how much he reveres them. He then talks about some things that he just felt like needed to be shared, and that just, were things that he felt necessary to get out of the way. About humility, if you remember all the lessons we talked about in regard to humility, and wanted to make sure he got some of those things out there. And then he talked about Epaphroditus. But now he gets to what he really wrote the letter for. Finally, he says, finally, my brethren. All right, so what he's saying is, I have come to the place where now I'm ready to tell you what I wrote the letter for. This is what it's all about. I said all of that, and it was needed to be said. It was important to be said. But now, he has finished his thoughts on those lines of thinking and his opening remarks and all those kind of things. He's now gotten to the place where, okay, now, finally, I'm going to tell you what we wrote this letter for. And he's written this letter as a warning because there were some problems going on in a lot of the churches. But he says, finally, my brethren, rejoice in the Lord. To write the same thing to me, indeed, is not grievous, but for you, it is safe. All right, so finally, he's to this. And here's the deal. Not that the previous things were unimportant. They are very important. But what he's saying is but this is the crux of why I've done. Those things that he had written up to this point could have waited. He didn't have to write those things. He could have waited until he sent Timothy. He could have waited in hopes that he was going to make that trip himself. They weren't things that were pressing, all right? They weren't things that just had to be written. But this is the reason he wrote the letter. What he's about to say now is why it was important to go ahead and get this letter to him quickly, all right? To get it out just as quickly as he could. Send Epaphroditus back, kind of kills two birds with one stone. You get to meet him, see him, and at the same time I can get this letter to you. But this is why I'm writing the letter now. This is why I'm getting it to you in the hands of Epaphroditus. This is it. This is what it's all about. This is why I want you to have this. All right? So he wanted to be sure and get this out. Had he not got it out soon enough, the end, it could have been absolutely disastrous had he not gotten the information soon enough. On a small note, have you ever had times where, and I realize, we can do things so much faster with text or whatever the case may be. And I know very often, I feel like I can't wait for Debbie to get home from the grocery store and tell her something I got to tell her then, or else it's too late because I wanted some more coffee. I didn't have any. And so I got to text her before she gets in line. You know what I'm saying? All of a sudden it becomes really important. I can't just wait till she gets home. Boy, I wish I'd had you get me some coffee. No, I got to try to text her, which is always a worthless deal because she's not going to answer her phone anyway. So I might as well just not. But nonetheless, that's the situation here to a great degree, to an nth degree. All right? I need to get this word out to you because there's a problem that is brewing. There's a problem that is stirring among the churches, and I want to make sure you don't get caught up in it before I have an opportunity to get there and talk to you about it. All right? So that's the reason. But in so doing, he says, rejoice in the Lord. Little reason to rejoice in any other because, quite frankly, everything else is temporal, amen? He could just say rejoice, but that just doesn't seem to get the job done. We're guilty of that sometimes, by the way, in a lot of different ways. Well, just be happy. Why? Be happy in what? Be happy because I have money? Be happy because I have friends? Be happy, why? And so what happens is sometimes we're really general in what we say, and all he's trying to do here is saying, listen, rejoice in the Lord, because he's about to set them up for this issue he's going to deal with. You need to rejoice in the Lord. You don't need to rejoice for any other reason. Everything else is temporal. Everything else is going to, when you die, you leave it behind. All right? It's just temporary, and that's it. And so he says, you have reason to rejoice in the Lord. And by the way, the issue that he's about to deal with here, and we'll get to that, I think, is the idea that he's saying, listen, we want you to rejoice in the Lord rather than rejoicing in things of the flesh. Don't rejoice because you're such a wonderful guy. Don't rejoice because you are so righteous. Don't rejoice because you are so much better than anybody else. Don't rejoice because you've got the upper hand on everybody else. Don't rejoice because you know more than that other guy. You see, that's some of the issues that they're going to face when the Judaizers happen to get into the churches. And I'll explain what a Judaizer is in the next verse. All right? But that's the picture. So he's saying, rejoice in the Lord, because he's about to give them some terrifying news, and he's about to give them some news that could undoubtedly turn their church upside down and destroy them. And so He wants to make sure that they get this and understand this. It's just too important not to. All right? And he says it like this also. He says to write the same thing to you. Now, he had already mentioned this earlier in the letter, back in chapter 1, verse 27 through 30. He had told them about some things. He had given them some very practical instructions. But here now he's going to tell them basically why those instructions were given, because he gave the instructions and then went off on another tangent. And so what we find here is he gets back to that, and in getting back to that, he wants to make sure that, listen, I don't want your new converts to get led astray. I don't want, young churches to be destroyed. I don't want folks that are really struggling with things to get caught up in some false doctrine. This is so important. And so there is so much here that's going on. And so he just needs to be sure and share these warnings so that they would have them. He realizes that the only reason he does so is for their safety in this matter. Saying, listen, I'm doing this. It's not grievous to me to do this. Some people say, well, this is hard for me to do, but man, I got to talk about this guy that just is teaching some false doctrine. I'm going to tell you now, I don't have a bit of problem with doing that. Guys out there teaching false doctrine, I'm going to tell you, don't listen to him. Don't listen to that guy. Kick him under the bus because he's lying to you. He's telling you some things that's going to send folks right to hell, and he's going to rob you of blessings. Don't listen to him. And so I don't have a problem saying that. Paul's saying, listen, this is not grievous for me. I'm just going to tell you that I'm letting you know because it's for your safety. I want to make sure that you understand that. Much of what we as pastors and teachers teach is for the purpose of keeping you, our congregation, safe from false teaching, safe from the things that are out there. It's not because we think we're elitist or better than everybody else, but because, quite frankly, I know the dangers of false teaching. I've seen it, witnessed it. I know of pastors that have fallen by the wayside. I know of churches that have fallen by the wayside. And as bad as it was in the days of Paul, I really do believe that today it might be even a greater danger because, quite frankly, those guys that are teaching false doctrine are more accessible. More accessible. In Paul's day, if they wanted to teach false doctrine, they pretty much had to come to your church and do it. In our day, man, all they got to do is just get them a website, get them a YouTube channel, do something. I mean, it's a pretty easy task for them today to get their false doctrine out there. And it amazes me, and I talk to pastors all the time, and we all have this issue, is our people within our congregations sometimes have, they want to get revived. They want to really get fired up for the Lord. And so the first thing they do is start looking at internet and searching out preachers and searching out teachers and not knowing the first thing about many of them. And before you know it, man, they're coming to me going, well, you know what? I've got an issue with what we're teaching here because so-and-so says. And it's like, oh, my goodness. And all of that's because it becomes so accessible. And so, there's a lot of that begins to take place and happens. All right? And I'm just like Paul. I guess sometimes get so amazed that people fall for such things. In fact, in this situation, the church of Philippi was founded by Paul. Most of the people in the church of Philippi were probably led to the Lord under Paul's ministry. In addition to that, Paul had probably tended to a lot of their needs in the time that he spent there. And I mean, their spiritual care, their salvation, their personal learning, their discipleship, all of that was probably at the hands of Paul. And now somebody comes in and starts teaching them something false. And before you know it, they abandon Paul and abandon the teachings of Paul. And it's like, seriously? I'm telling you, Satan is a master deceiver. He really is. And it amazes me at times where I've had the opportunity to lead folks to Jesus Christ, and all of a sudden, friends that had nothing to do with them prior to in regard to spiritual matters, all of a sudden now have drug them off to other churches or drug them off to, false doctrines or false teachings or something crazy, and it's like, they had nothing to do with anything. We're the ones that cared enough to come to your door. We're the ones that cared enough to share the gospel with you. We're the ones that cared enough to spend that time, that energy, and that effort. And then all of a sudden, these people who have never shared Christ with you now have the better answer. And it just puzzles me But that's what's happened. That's what these guys were doing. And so Paul's saying, hey, listen, I don't know if they've made their way to you yet or not, but beware, they're coming. All right, these guys are coming. Well, who are these guys? In verse 2, we're actually, and thereon, verse 2, verse 3, and so on, we find out that these guys are what we call Judaizers. A Judaizer was guys who took the law of Moses, the law that were given to the Jews, that Jesus Christ fulfilled on the cross of Calvary, a law that we no longer would acknowledge, even the Jews no longer need to acknowledge, and they were taking that law and incorporating it into the church life. And so these Gentiles, for example, who had grown up outside of that law, trusted Jesus Christ as their Lord and Savior, they come up there and they come into the church, say all these Gentiles, they need to adhere to the law, and the guys need to be circumcised because it's a part of the law. We need to acknowledge these things, and we need to incorporate these things into the church because it's a part of salvation. If you're not willing to do that, you want nothing to do with God. And they were what we would call legalists. Cody Sunday night had mentioned this, that we sometimes, a lot of preachers misunderstand what legalism means. Legalism is when we try to incorporate other things into salvation that does not belong. All right? If I were to tell you baptism is essential for salvation, I'm a legalist. If I tell you your good works are essential for salvation, I'm a legalist. If I tell you that keeping the law that God had given Israel is essential for salvation, I'm a legalist because I've changed salvation. All right? And so that's what legalism is. The Judaizers were preaching and teaching what we would deem legalism. Now, look in verse 2 and see what he calls them. Paul doesn't mince words here. I mean, he just tells it like it is. There's no sugarcoating. There's no holding back concerning the dangers they impose. And so even the way he describes them tells us the danger of who they are. Beware of dogs. Beware of evil workers. Beware of the concision. Now I want to hit all three of those here for just a second. All three of those deal with the same people. These are not three different people. He just uses three different ways to explain the dangers that they impose upon people. Number one, he says, beware of dogs. Now, today, that's a pretty slanderous term. If somebody called you a dog, you would take great offense. But in their day, it was even worse because a dog in their day wasn't your little house pet. It was a scavenger. These dogs would roam the streets and eat the garbage and that kind of things. They were scavengers. And so they were looked down upon in the sense that, it was like if we were, talk about rats or mice or whatever, these were scavengers. And so that was the concept. He's saying, listen, they are nothing but scavengers. They're not out leading people to Jesus Christ. They're out trying to scavenge on the people that have been led to the Lord so that they might prevent them, drag them away from the things of God, and prevent them from becoming what God really wants them to become. The dogs. They prey on young converts that don't know any better. They prey on folks that have never really studied enough and learned enough and grew enough. And they prey on the weak. That's what the dogs do. So he's saying they were dogs. A second thing about those dogs, by the way, is they're dogs, like I said, they weren't tame, they weren't house pets, they were wild, did their own thing. They were uncontrollable, and what they did was they just followed their own natural instincts, caring only for themselves. That's what false teachers do. False teachers don't care about you. They want to be famous. They want money in their pocket. They don't care about you. You will never convince me that your Joel Osteens, your Creflo Dollars, or any of those other yahoos, and I'll call them by name because they're false teachers, you'll never convince me that they're in it for any other reason but to put $1 in their pocket or to be famous. And when I look at that picture, I think they're dogs. That's what they are. They're dogs. They're uncontrollable, doing their own thing, following their own self-will, and it honestly has nothing to do with the things of God. The second thing he calls them, he says, beware of evil workers. These Judaizers pride themselves in their own righteousness. This is kind of interesting. Because the idea in saying that you have to work your way to heaven, you have to add all of these works of the flesh, and that's what it is. Be circumcised, guys, in order to be saved. It's a work of the flesh. It's something we do. It's something that we would have done to ourselves. He's saying, you're evil doers, you're evil workers, and that's a real slap in the face to them because they think themselves to be more righteous than everybody else. I am more righteous than you. The Pharisees walked around, trying to make sure that everybody knew how righteous they were. When they were fasting, they made sure everybody knew they were fasting because they wanted to appear more righteous. They did everything out in the open so everybody could see what they did. They wanted to make sure everybody knew what they did. If they visited somebody that was sick, don't you know they're going to make sure everybody knows, I visited the sick. If they did lead someone to the Lord, in their estimation, they would let everybody know, we converted this person. They want to make sure their name gets out there. They want to make sure they get the credit because they want to be more righteous than everybody else. We want you to look at me. Look at how wonderful I am. Look at how righteous I am. That was them. And so what Paul says, oh no, they're unrighteous. They're evil. Everything they're doing is consumed in their own pride and their own self-interests. Everything they do is about manifesting themselves and letting everybody see who they are. So he just turns that tide in the sense that he says, here they are talking about how righteous they are, but in reality, they're evil. They're not righteous at all. So these pious Pharisees, these Judaizers, trying to say you had to keep the law like they do, they're so wonderful. He's saying they're evil workers. I had a guy one time, I had a long story, so I'm just going to say the end result of this. This guy came to my house for what was supposed to be a Bible study, and he brought another guy with him from his church. And as soon as they walked in, I knew right away what was going on because they were a part of a church that believed that you had, if you sinned, you just lose everything again. You had to start all over again. And so they came in. He was saying, I have not sinned in 6 years. I said, you liar. I said, you're a bold-faced liar. That's this. That's this. Look at me, how wonderful I am. You're a liar. So what happens is exactly, even the pride in so doing is a sin. You're right. And so what happens is he says, listen, you're not righteous. You're an evil worker. And then the last one, he says, beware of concision. Concision's an interesting word. It's a word that a lot of people probably wouldn't know. The Greek word that you find there, that is the underword for this word concision, is only found one time in the Bible. One time. And what he's saying is this. He's saying, all that you have done, concision has to do with making a bad cut or making a cut for all the wrong reason, to mutilate, to mess it up bad. So he's saying, you're out here saying, listen, look at me. I'm a great man. I'm righteous because the law says that I should be circumcised, so I'm circumcised so I can be closer to God. Guys, you better get circumcised or you won't be close enough to God. That's the picture. All right, that's what they're trying to do. It's a part of salvation. And so in so doing, he tells them the word concision means you have mutilated yourself. He's saying you did it for all the wrong reasons. So what happens is listen, you were doing it for your righteousness, to say, look at me. You were doing it to say, look how wonderful I am. Look how righteous I am. Instead of, I serve a righteous God and I need to be separated from this world that I might serve him. So he says, in reality, because you did it for all the wrong reasons, that's what we're talking about in this concision, because you did it for all the wrong reasons, you mutilated yourself because it really doesn't mean squat. Doesn't bring you any closer to the Lord. You're following the law. You're trying to abide by the law for all the wrong reasons, and so it doesn't mean anything. And just as a word of warning, Baptist, we can do that very same thing. If you was baptized just so you could say, look at me. If you observe the Lord's Supper just so you can say, look at me. If you carry your King James, the bigger the better so everybody can see it, look at me. All of those things, any service you do, any ministry you do, if you do it to say, look at me, that's you. It's for all the wrong reasons. It doesn't glorify God. All that we do must be to glorify God. So what Paul's saying, listen, these guys aren't glorifying God. They're looking to glorify themselves. Don't get caught up in it. Beware. All right? We'll talk more about it next week. All right? A lot of stuff in that verse people don't realize, I think, sometimes. So we'll pick up in verse 3 next week. Glad all of you came out. Glad you came out to be a part of Wednesday night. And if those of you that haven't come out much on Wednesday night, this is what we do. And I hope you enjoyed it. Hope you feel like you learned something. Know a little more about God's Word. All right? Let's pray. Dear Father, Lord, thank you so much for all you do. Thank you for all these that are here tonight. Lord, it's just such an honor to be able to stand before them. And Lord, thank you for the opportunity. And I ask, Lord, that you'll just speak to our hearts and our lives. Thank you for all that I learn as we study this. Lord, it's just good for me to be able to see it and to hear it and study it out and to know it. And Lord, it's just good. It's good for me to know those things. Lord God, I pray that you'll watch over us now as we go into our homes. May you bless us, watch over us, care for us, keep us safe. And Lord, may we be faithful to serve you. It's in Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Thank you so much.